Welcome to another edition of How to Yard. Today we're working on an 89 Acura Integra. At one point this car was the car of choice for those 84, 87 Civic and CRX builds. This one is a dual overhead cam, a manual transmission Integra. If you've ever owned one of these, you would have realized this car is mega fast for what it is. I know when I first got one, it was early 2000s, right when I got into Hondas and I drove one of these things. The fastest car I had at the time was a 90 Accord. It was manual, but I thought that was fast to take it down the track, and it did 17s. So this car right here felt like a 13-second car. We ended up taking it to the track. It did run like a mid-16, but that was still fast to me. Looking over the car, it looks in great shape. Makes me a little worried that the engine might not be any good, but everything's here. We got the brakes, the rear discs, and let's look under the hood. Opening reveals what we're here after, the dual overhead cam 1.6 liter. What's great about this, it's got a manual transmission with short gear ratios and intermediate shaft. That means it has equal length axles. This thing is potent, certainly was for its time. This isn't a swap I would normally grab, but we are working on a new project car. The newest addition to our fleet is an 87 Honda Crx SI, and the wiring harness is very similar to what we're going to be working on here. What's cool about the swap, it's almost a complete drop-in. It's just like if you were taking like a 94 Acura Integra and putting it in 92 Civic. It's very similar. So we're going to grab the engine, the transmission, the motor mounts, the shift linkage. We're also going to have to bring parts of the suspension, which we'll get into in this video. This one in particular is pretty straight, and it doesn't look like it's been in an accident of any kind. So I'm going to take a 17 and I'm going to just go ahead and rotate the engine. And right away it feels like there's some compression. If it was seized or if it felt very loose, then that would suggest that maybe there's a problem with the valves or that the timing belt broke. For those that aren't aware, this is a D16A1. In Japan they would be considered a ZC. It is D-series platform right up here about the exhaust manifold. That means any of the aftermarket D-series stuff that involves the exhaust manifold will work on this engine. Isn't that cool? As per usual, I'm going to be working on the bottom of the vehicle first. Axles are something that I'm going to pull and I'm going to need for our swap, including this hub. This is something that we normally don't have to take for swaps, but in this case, we're going to need it. The 84-87 knuckle is smaller and it won't accept the larger 32mm axle. So this whole assembly we're going to have to take. It's going to drive the cost of our total pullout quite a bit because most yards charge for the caliper separately, they charge for the rotor separately, then they're going to charge for the knuckle. It is what it is. So to start off, we'll start with the 32mm and make quick work with our impact gun here by Milwaukee. We also have a 3/8 impact gun by Milwaukee. I am so glad that I added this to my build, my tool arsenal here. So I'm going to be able to knock off this tie rod nut really quick and fast. It's small and compact and has the power we need to knock those things out. There's something we normally don't have to worry about, and that is the brake lines. Well, we can't take these. Most yards won't sell you a rubber brake line because it's just a safety problem they don't want to have to deal with, so we're going to have to unbolt it, but we are going to take the caliper. I can't quite remember if the Civic caliper will bolt onto the Integra knuckle, so we're going to take it anyway because we're here and these look to be in great shape. I'm going to knock the tie rod off now before we loosen the knuckle from the strut. Loosening the knuckle from the strut is going to help prevent pulling the axle and separating it. As this knuckle comes from the strut, you'll see I just used a 17 right there and the knuckle came loose. Oh, look at that. You see how that dropped down and the axle's still in the knuckle here. And if it was still attached to the tie rod, it can make things a lot more difficult. What I'm trying to do is prevent any damage to this axle, and it looks like it's seized in there pretty good. So what I'm going to do is put this axle nut back on, which is going to help prevent damaging it while I try to knock it through. But it might damage our nut, but that's less expensive to replace than the entire axle. We did do some damage to that nut, beating it up. That's because these axles look like they're original and they haven't been pulled out before, which they were a bit seized in there. For those that don't know, we're in Denver. There's lots of snow and salt and magnesium, and all that stuff is hard on components like that. But we were able to save the axle and our knuckle here. Okay, one last component we got left here is the lower ball joint, and that's gonna complete our front knuckle. You're gonna repeat this process on the other side. Here, I like to use a set of dikes because they have a lot of dexterity to grab these cotter pins. But if you have any issues where you can't get the cotter pin out, I've gotten to the point where I've just been able to clip the ends off and then just zip my gun right onto it. So we're gonna bring our 3/8 impact gun. This thing is nice and small and get into places, but is it enough? Oh, get this one, man. This is an awesome tool. The hubs are out. We're gonna take our pry bar and just pull it in between the transmission and the axle, and boom, that's out. We're gonna be taking the shift linkage. This is a 10mm right here. Break that loose, and then we'll bring in my Milwaukee battery ratchet, which I love. Makes quick, easy work of it. There's washers right here, and they're curved at a certain way where it actually goes inside the bushing of the shift linkage. You want to keep that. I believe there's another one on the other side. Here it is. It's stuck in there, and I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose them either one of them, so I'm going to put them back on. This is what's called they call it a bad word pin, because it's really hard to get out. A lot of people don't know how it functions. So first off, it's got this protective cover there we're going to remove, and then we're going to bring in a roll pin punch set. So if you look right here on the tip, it's got this little dimple on it, and it's going to go right inside the rod there. We just have to pick the right size here. What that does is it prevents the tool from walking. A lot of people complain about this pin just because they don't know how to get it out, and this is the tool for that. And then we just work our way off, and there it is. Another part we wouldn't be too concerned with would be the motor mounts, but because this is a swap, we are concerned with them. So we'll want to make sure to grab all the hardware and all the brackets that we're going to need, because we'll need this to put this in our 8487. So it's been so long since I pulled one of these engines out, I'm not exactly sure what all needs to come out. So I'm just going to loosen up all of them that I can see here, and any more that I find I'll loosen up also, just to completely separate it. These were all 17mm, and again I'm using my Milwaukee 12-volt battery ratchet. I love it. I'm going to take off the AC compressor while I'm down here, and I want to give myself lots of room to work, which are a series of 10mm and some plastic clips. They're hidden all around. I've explained in many of my videos I like to work on the bottom first, and I do that because when you start working up top, you get fuel line loose and other fluids, and then they end up dripping on you, and then you're going to be laying in a bunch of stuff on the ground. I want as much room as possible, and so I'm going to remove this radiator. But something to consider when swapping is radiator hoses. This upper radiator hose I'm going to be able to use on my swap, because the Civic radiator is going to be shaped differently, and this one is obviously the shape I'm going to need. Now, this one looks new, so I'm going to go ahead and grab that. It's going to save me some bucks later on. The lower one's cut, but I believe I can use the Civic lower radiator hose. Now we have quite a bit more room to see what is left to remove. We have things like the battery tray over there, and we have the AC lines and the AC compressor. We picked up our 87 on whim. It came up on a Facebook marketplace, really inexpensive. The engine was blown, so there was no way to test whether the AC on that car worked or not. And I'm not too sure if I'm worried about using the AC on that car anyway, since it's going to be a swap car. We're not going to be taking the AC compressor. Now we have our clutch cable, but you may need to know how to remove this cable first. By pulling up on the clutch arm, you can loosen the cable by turning this knob here up top. What it's going to do is loosen the cable enough to where you can slide the cable through the bracket that's holding it, push it down, and then now the cable is longer, and pull the cable back up, pull it around, and then now it's off. So then we could pull the cable back up through the bracket here, and then there we go. The throttle cable is also something else we're going to want with our swap. The throttle cable stay is probably in a different location, and the cable is most likely longer. We know that this one works, so there's two 12s, and it works as a jam nut in between the cable stay. We loosen both sides, and then we're going to loosen the nut all the way to a section that is free of threads. It's the point where we'll be able to pull the cable off of the stay and off of our throttle body. And we're not going to be using this wiring harness, although pieces of the wiring harness would come in handy, like the distributor plugs and the injector plugs. We can remove the wiring harness straight from the shock tower. Other things we're going to take: this fuel line. That's probably going to be different. We can disconnect it right here from the fuel filter. Heater hoses as well, right? We'll disconnect them from the chassis and we'll just keep them on the engine. Usually that stuff they don't really charge extra for, and if it's different, then that's gonna save you some dollars. And these look in great condition. Along with the fuel pressure hose, just underneath this fuse box is the fuel return, and it looks long, and the fuel pressure regulator is far from it, and it's in great shape. So just in case I need this extra length, I'm going to take this too. The wiring harness, heater hoses are off. Tedious work, take your time. What we're working on now is right down there. That is our speed sensor. Okay, they have what's called a Jesus clip on there. I don't know why they call it that, but maybe that's what you say trying to get it off. So there's a cap over the top. Oh, well, it pulled right out. So this cable right here is on our Civic. Don't have to worry about that, just move it out of the way. The thing we won't be using is the power steering pump. This will probably be easier to remove with the engine out. There's things like the brake booster and the wiring harness on this side that we disconnect, and then we're ready to pull the motor out. We're going to be using a seat belt to wrap around the power steering bracket right here, and then we'll wrap it around something that's probably going to make you squirm, and that's the distributor. Well, on the Honda blocks there's not a whole lot of places to mount a hoist. I saw H Motors on mine do this, and I'm like, well, if they're doing that, then it should be okay, and I've done it ever since. So as long as we're clear of all the clips that we want to save, and it's not wrapped around the cap itself, and all the bolts are on the distributor, it's going to be good to go. So as far as engine mounts go, it looks like we have just the transmission over here. There's a couple of bolts here. We most likely want to take the entire bracket right here because I don't know that it's going to be the same on our Civic. There we go. Yeah, I guess it was that easy. It looks like to make sure to get this mount off, it would have to come off from the bottom. but I don't want to get underneath the car while it's all loose. You can see the engine could fall on us if it's not secure. Still feels like something's hung up, and it is our rear motor mount. That's exactly why we want to make sure to take care of everything while we're underneath, because if we discover something as we're lifting the engine up and it's up on the hoist, if one of these items were to fail while we're underneath the car, we've got big problems. That puddle down there that we see, that's why we do things on the bottom also first, because when we lift up the engine or start disconnecting all the hoses, that's stuff that we're going to be laying in. And we're looking at this rear motor mount that we're going to have to take off also. You see that there's three nuts right there on top. 214s. And as far as the shift linkage goes, there's two 12s back here. I'll probably want to take the hardware with me. Although, if I had to guess, the Civic is going to be the same. The whole swap's out, all our brackets are out. Well, we'll just take a once over here over the things that you'll want to make sure to grab. But what's cool about this being the D16A1 is that the bolt pattern is the same as other D-series transmissions, which means, you know, your hydraulic transmissions could bolt onto this if you wanted it to. I'm going to be putting things back on there like the brackets here, because first off, we don't want to lose anything and or the hardware. And it looks like less stuff too that you're buying, so they usually see things as a whole and aren't, you know, picking and choosing, and you end up spending a lot more money than you really need to. One of the last things we're going to cover is the ECU. On these cars, they trick you a little bit. Unlike the newer vehicles where they're underneath the passenger kick panel, they're actually located right underneath the passenger seat. We got a weather cover here. I'm sure it's for water and stuff. Maybe if you spill stuff on your seat and drips down through it, at least it won't get onto the computer. There's our computer. There's going to be a set of 10mm bolts holding it on. Should confirm that's the right one we're looking for, PG7. And this is OBD 0. And we're going to keep our swap OBD 0 also. That concludes what time we have today. I was hoping to be able to get the rear disc out on this one, but what I believe will happen is you're going to be looking for a how to swap this engine into our 8487, and we'll come and get the rear discs on a later date, and then we could do the how-to in that video series. But right now we're going to go check out, find out how much this is really going to cost us. We got away with quite a bit. Remember, we have a complete fuel line here. We got a complete throttle cable here. We got all the injectors, throttle body, distributor, complete wiring harness. We have our upper radiator hose. We have our heater hose, our rear heater hose, our bracket, our our speed sensor, we got our intermediate shaft, we got the alternator, we have our Integra front knuckles, our Integra shifter and axles and ECU. We got out of there spending $480, but remember, we didn't have any cores. If you know we're gonna go out there and pull an engine or a transmission, and if you have those spares laying around, make sure to bring them. You'll be able to save some bucks right then and there. Otherwise, you can bring them back later on, depending on the yard that you go to. Along with this new project, we got other projects like the CRX build that we're working on over there. We have an H22 sit in front of it. Who knows, it might receive that engine. We have a K-Series all-wheel drive CRX, which is also featured on our YouTube channel. And then this right here, you got to definitely look out. This right here was my very first car. This right here is Hush 22. We'll get into more detail about that. All right, this is our project car. This is our 87 CRX SI. It's pretty decent for what it is. You remember, it's like way over 30 years old. It's relatively stock, and it's pretty much all there. And this is our busted motor. This is going to come out. We could actually use this engine as our core. That way we're not stuck with it here anyway, so we might just do that. Guys, thank you very much for tuning in. Make sure to check out our other videos right here on our channel. Make sure to check out our website at hushperformance.com for all of your 84, 87, 88, 91 Honda Civic or CRX needs. Guys, like always, happy tuning.